Hi, welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In this video, I'm going to be analyzing the dungeons of Nintendo's JRPG on the NES and Famicom called Mother, or Earthbound in the United States, which was eventually retitled Earthbound Beginnings for the Nintendo Switch Online. It's a JRPG that instead of being set in a medieval fantasy world, is set in modern-day United States, and is a bit of a joke towards the JRPG genre. The graphics resemble the Peanuts comic strips more than anime, and it was made by a company called Ape Inc., which eventually was replaced by Creatures Inc. and was published by Nintendo. It didn't come out in the US, although an English prototype was made. However, it did get 2 sequels, and the protagonist is in Nintendo's long-running crossover fighting game series, Super Smash Bros. The graphics were pretty good, and the dungeons were somewhat interesting, so in this video I'll be analyzing them. First of all, the graphics and style seemed a lot more 3D and resembles some of the future RPG games that would be made in later generations rather than the traditional 8-bit dungeon style. There aren't that many dungeons though, and some of the caves and buildings are so small that they might as well not even be considered dungeons. The first major dungeon is the Crystal Cavern. It starts with several identical paths where only 2 of them lead anywhere. There's one magical item you can find and one passageway into the lowest floor. The lowest floor has more items and a sleeping dragon that you won't be able to wake up. And there's a fish boss. After this, there's an NPC and a way out of the dungeon and to another section on the overworld. So this is actually a passageway dungeon. While this dungeon may look better, the monsters are generic and not very difficult at a high level. Near the end of the game, you can come back to awaken the dragon and battle it. If you beat it, you will get a melody the main characters can perform. Sweet Little's Factory is the next dungeon. This dungeon is full of rats, and the purpose of coming is to get a bottle rocket. Also, pretty much all the doors lead to treasure. So honestly, it's pretty simple compared to the next one. The next dungeon is basically the same thing, but is a lot bigger. It's the Duncan Factory. This Duncan Factory has much better monsters, and they're all themed after the factory. The dungeon is sprawling and vast. It's full of rooms containing treasure, and some rooms that are just dead ends. The highest point has a set of rockets that you have to set off to blow up some train tracks. While it's really big, most of the areas look the same, so it's really difficult to navigate. Also, there are parts that intersect, where there are only 2 sections with heavy choices and large number of rooms to navigate, while a lot of them are just straight pathways. Plus, there's no boss battle. The next dungeon is a haunted house called Rosemary's Manor. It's a mansion in a haunted town that's full of some devastating monsters such as ghosts, enchanted armor, bionic bats, exploding dust balls, and zombies, along with 2 new zombie variants. While there's a lot of treasure, which is all minor items, the point is to find a piano and learn a certain melody. This dungeon is very similar to the ghost houses in the Super Mario franchise. There's puzzles where the walkways send you around in circles where they lead back to the same place, and 2 paths leading into lower floors are unable to access the cellar where the piano is, so you have to look around and find it right at the beginning. Also, there's enough treasure to keep the player looking, and these monsters are actually challenging even at a high level and require strategy to survive. The Monkey Grotto is the next dungeon. It doesn't have enemies, but has a sprawling maze and a bunch of NPCs where some tell the truth and some are lying. There's a few pieces of treasure, but not many. At the end of the game, there's a series of caves, peaks, and plateaus on a mountain called Mount Aitoi. The first of all is a large dungeon inside caves leading into the plateau. It has many different directions and is full of well-distributed treasure, including the most powerful weapons in the game for the 3 characters you enter with. There are many different ways to go, and many of them link up. However, like a lot of JRPG dungeons, the most basic route is simple once you find it. This makes it a decent passageway dungeon. The player will probably have to go through this one more than once, because the monsters in the plateau after it are extremely difficult. Plus, the monsters in this dungeon are very tough, but not as hard as the enemies in the plateau of the next section. There are only 2 monsters in this dungeon, a variant of the Starmen seen in the rest of the game, and a synthetic life form called a Cerebrum. They both require a lot of strategy to beat. After this, there's corridors, mountain peaks, and plateaus leading up to the final boss. Overall, this game is pretty interesting, but the dungeons are not the most impressive. Although the graphics are better than most JRPGs on this console, the art choices and camera angles make the dungeons worse than average. Also, most of them look the same throughout rather than featuring rooms that look different. This makes them difficult and less enjoyable to explore. However, a couple are decent, such as the Mount Itoi cave at the end, which is pretty big and sprawling. Also, there's the Rosemary Manor, which is pretty complex despite the camera angle and its awful appearance that looks like a set of magic rooms floating in a void rather than a haunted house, which it's supposed to be. But there's quantity and there's quality. Some of these monsters pose a decent challenge at their point in the game, and some are themed to fit the dungeon pretty well. While the dungeons may be inconsistent and lackluster, there's still an interesting take on early JRPG dungeons. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.